Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Richard Martin. I'm Director of Education and Public Programs here at the Whitechapel Gallery, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you all to this very special research seminar with Zoe Diao. Since last October, Zoe has been undertaking the Asymmetry Curatorial Fellowship here at the gallery, and during her time with Whitechapel, she's been part of our exhibitions team, which is led by our chief curator, Lydia Yee, and she's been supervised by Naya, who's the head of our archive and our curatorial studies, and working closely with Naya and with our colleague Inez Costa. Zoe was closely involved in Galleries in the Groove, which is our current show in the Archives Gallery, just a couple of floors beneath us, which brings together 3 visionary galleries in London, New York, and Antwerp. And if you haven't yet seen that show, I'd really recommend checking it out. Prior to beginning her fellowship here in London, Zoe was an exhibition manager at Long March Space in Beijing and an assistant curator at the Ulan Center for Contemporary Art in Beijing. And Zoe studied in China, in the US, and in the UK, developing particular interests in the intersections between art and anthropology and in contemporary Asian art studies. And I want to thank you, Zoe, for generously sharing your work with us this afternoon. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Zoe Diao.
First of all, I would like to say thank you to the Whitechapel team for all your help during my residency, especially Lydia and Naya from Curatorial, Fellini, Miles from the archive, who have been so supportive and generous. If any part of my research is interesting, it came from the wonderful archives which I had the pleasure to work on. I also want to thank everyone for coming, my Asymmetry family, Delphina family, and everyone who made it here today. The conversations I had with many of you inspired me and guided me through this journey. So this presentation is a midterm review of the research I've been doing about the storytelling of artists in post-war London. It will end up in a writing piece, but today I just wish to share with you the methodologies I've been using, how I structured the materials I found, and the questions I'm trying to answer with this research. So it's pretty much a literature overview, which I hope will be interesting to you. And of course, I'm learning from this process and would love to hear your feedbacks and advice for the next stage. My research started from the theoretical studies of storytelling as a traditional way of to pass down knowledge to younger generations, a narrative tool to convey ideology and identity, and also an approach to explain phenomena with provided vocabulary. But there are also some aspects of storytelling I've been very interested in, and the first one is storytelling and memory. Memory is not a mechanically perfect function of our brains. It's not a recorded happenings, but reconstructed experience of the past. There are different types of memories, but what is related to storytelling is primarily autobiographical memory. Autobiographical memory is usually a combination of episodic memory, which is personal experience, and generic memory. Sometimes it's called implicit memory or semantic memory, but they all refer to the direct, general knowledge shared within a society. In Asian Native American storytelling, Bruce Bellinger pointed out that meaningful events can often be represented as a category of experience that may provide a schema to make memories easier to recall and retain. When he talks about schema, it can also be seen as a narrative in which the unmeaningful experience have to be forgotten. It's like when you think back to your first visit to a museum, you may remember the first painting you see, but not the first pillar or barrier. And the second aspect is storytelling and temporality. According to Robin Horton, memory remote the past in the image of the present to minimize the amount of change that has taken place through time. This explains why when we see a friend from 10 years ago, at first we may talk like nothing has changed ever since until new information makes us realize the difference. When an autobiographical memory is told, it becomes a story. According to Rofodo Maggio, storytelling is an intersubjective creation of experience. With verbal and nonverbal storytelling techniques, a storyteller would actively filter and rework past experience according to their own understanding and imagination. At the same time, they are also trying to create a dialogue with the audience to discover what Ballinger called the shared reality. In other words, both storyteller and the audience would be changed by the experience of storytelling. This also means that a story cannot be static. When a story is repeated or retold, it's constantly readjusting and deviating from the original version, similar to the process of adaptive evolution. As Walter Ong argues, that the originality of a story consists not in the introduction of new materials, but in fitting the old materials effectively into each individual, unique situation. A very common idea is that the history of storytelling dates back to the prehistoric cave drawings. So it started from visual art, but in fact the link is much deeper. Before we talk about storytelling and art, we need to notice the link between art and playing. Art as a human adaptation derives from the behavior of playing, which is universal in the society of human beings and at least mammals. As humans, we are particularly interested in the games that involves flight, such as chasing and running, fight, and recovery of balance. Through practice, repetition, and experiment, we can identify the design condition and subsequently make decisions and take actions. As human beings, we also have the compulsion to listen and tell stories. Same as playing, stories can improve our capability to be less restricted by the reality we have, and to deal with it with more flexibility. Some scholars also linked storytelling with the multi-level selection theory and reciprocal altruism. Brian Boyd argues that stories provide us with memorable and shared models of cooperation that stir our social emotions and desire to associate with altruists, just like how religious stories can establish a secret spirit police. In the same way, art stimulates recognition of patterns for interpretation. Repetitive representations of themes, events, or concepts train our mind to think beyond the present materiality and create new experience. Since art and the story have this long relationship together, it seems natural that we all grew up with the stories of legendary artists. But in fact, it is a relatively new tradition. We all know that the Lives of Artists by Vasari is considered to be the first important literature of Western art history. And for centuries, it was the main source and model of Western art history and artists' biographies. However, one of the most notable influences it left is the hierarchy of artists and styles. For Vasari, Michelangelo was the pinnacle of artistic genius. Everything before and after couldn't compare, let alone his contemporaries from other regions of Italy or any part of the world. Moreover, many of Vasari's stories emphasized on the genius of artists is inherent but not later developed. To prove this point, the stories usually start from the artist's childhood, how their talent was accidentally discovered by an older artist, who gave them training and taught them skills until one day the young artist surpassed the teacher. Ernst Kreis and Otto Kurz noticed the patterns and stereotypes of artist stories. Their book, Legend, Myth, and Magic in the Image of the Artist, was considered an unusual book when first published in 1934. Kreis and Kurz looks into the anecdotes of artists from ancient Greece until the 1930s and try to find the cultural archetypes of these myths of artists with psychoanalytical and sociological approach. In the book, the authors focus on the stories in which artists become heroes, magician, and in the final chapter is about the stories that indicated artists' position in the society. I became interested in the stories of artists because of this book when I was an undergraduate. So I wish to share with you part of my previous research about Tang Dynasty artists of China as an alternative view to this topic. In China, connoisseurship of art started from 6th century. The author Xie He created a ranking system for 27 artists from the 2nd century to his own time. The ranking system became the foundation of Chinese art studies, and it's still influential even today. But in these books, little was mentioned about artists' life. Even for many Song Dynasty masters, we don't even know when they were born. However, there are many artist stories in unofficial historical records, especially in the categories of 志怪, which means collection of strange stories, and 小说, which means anecdotes or tales. But different from Vasari's semi-god artists, Asian Chinese artists have bipolar characters. The first one is similar to the artists as magician stories. Interestingly, these stories started from the time when the perspective drawings were introduced to China through the Silk Road from the West. So there are stories of painted dragons became alive and so on. And the second type are the stories of artists and the royal family. In front of the emperor, all artists would lose their magic. This is a very brief story collected in Li Rong's book, 读一志. It's about a 2nd century emperor who built a high tower building. So on every tower building, there's a plaque with the name inscribed. But the workers accidentally put on the plaque before the name was written, so the emperor ordered a calligrapher to be sent up in a cart with rope to write the title. Because the building was very high and the calligrapher was so scared that all his hair turned white when he came back down. Fast forward to my current research. As many of you already knew, I became interested in the story of artists in post-war London, especially how they were telling their own stories. I need to do more research on this, but I assume it was a new phenomenon from the beginning of 20th century when refugees from Russian Empire settled down in Britain, followed by more refugee artists who escaped Nazi Germany in the 1930s. This process also coincided with the development of modern art museums and galleries, and as they became more accessible and community-based. Whitechapel Gallery was actually one of the first institutions helped raising funds for the refugee artists who came to London with no government schemes to support their living. While Britain brought hope for the refugee artists, the local art communities were also revitalized by the fresh perspective and the influence unfolded in the next few decades. Among these artists, there was Nam Gambo, who was born in Russia and lived in Berlin, Paris, Oslo. He lived in London from 1936 for 10 years before he immigrated into the United States. Gambo was in the same circle of the British artists such as Paul Nash, Henry Moore, Barbara Hepworth, and Ben Nicholson. And his constructivism concepts inspired both Hepworth and Moore. The British artist Robert Cookhorn met Jekyll Adler in Glasgow in 1943. Adler was born in Poland and was a friend of Paul Klee and Otto Dix. During the World War II, he volunteered for Polish army and lived in Scotland after discharged. So Cookhorn referred to Adler as the master and almost immediately took on the expressive features of his paintings. When I first started this research, I assumed the storytelling of British artists would be in contrast to that of the international artists who later moved to London. But the more materials I found, the more I became interested in the dialogue in between and the storytelling situation they are facing together. For this research, I've been working with various archival materials, and I try not to only look at the well-known artists, but also the emerging artists at the time, as well as the international artists who were introduced to the London audience. In this section, I will present you some of the materials I found, mostly from Whitechapel Archive, Tate Archive, and the Henry Moore Institute. The most simple and straightforward artist biographies are from the exhibition materials, which were called the Biographical Notes. We are all very familiar with the format today, but the content was quite different. At least in the case of the Whitechapel exhibitions, these notes were first drafted by the artists or their family. The curatorial team will then produce a detailed timeline based on the draft and further research, then tailor it for catalog or as a reference for exhibition introduction. If we consider the original draft as memory and the published catalog as storytelling, through this process we can see how the stories were formed, but in a collective way with the institutions involved. This is the biographical notes of the photographer Ida Carr for her 1960 Whitechapel solo show. On the left is the draft, which is very simple. This is not the artist's handwriting, but probably notes taken by the museum. It has 3 sections. The first one is place of birth, Tambov near Moscow, and then portion by nationality, before marriage, educated in French lycée in Egypt and Paris. The third section is no longer biographical, but a description. Photographs in the exhibition not only mint of personalities, but also aesthetically good. Other people are photographers, but not good photographs. But in the second draft, we can see it's now more chronological, with information like trained as a singer and the surrealist period moved to the front. But it also gives me the impression that her professional career actually started after he moved to London. Considering Ida Carr's exhibition was the first ever institutional solo show of a photographer in London, this is actually a very important example of how the artists were introduced to the audience. And now I want to move back for 10 years to 1950 exhibition, Painter's Progress. This is a group exhibition of British artists, including John Armstrong, Duncan Grant, Keith Vaughan, and several others. I found this exhibition very interesting, as each catalog task consists of a short biography and a statement from the artist. There's no standard format, so they vary from long articles to short paragraphs. But there's always something about their original family, especially their father's job. If this kind of information was trying to show which class was the artist coming from, so the audience might feel closer to the artist, why they would mention if they were only child or third son or fifth children, or in their family, or if he was continually ill. And for international artists, just like Ida Carr, in addition to where they were born and who were their parents, it also seemed to be important to mention their ethnicity. So now we know Sidney Nolan was the 5th generation Irish descent in Australia, and Nicholas Daskalopoulos was born in St. Petersburg but was of Baltic origin. Another detail I found interesting is some of the biographies will describe the landscape of the artist's hometown, mostly for British artists. But the general idea is that the artist would be affected by the landscape of their native country. So Robert Cohen's hometown has vivid colors. Landscape of Alan Davis' hometown has a Dutch quality. He's from Scotland, as well as Cecil Collins and Jack Smith, whose artworks were also linked to their own native landscape. So we can see the difference in these biographies from what we have today, but it's not completely different. We may no longer mention if the artist is the younger of two brothers or if their father's profession, maybe not in a direct way. But since like the place of birth or education background is still considered to be essential, even if the artist moved away from his place of birth at the age of 3, on the exhibition caption, it will still be the same. So in this increasingly globalized age, are we going to realize this kind of narrative is no longer effective anytime soon? Are we finally going to give up finding the artistic root of an artist from their childhood, whether the idea of becoming an artist came from their mother, uncle, school teacher, or the chimney they saw every day? Or are we going to tell new stories? Now moving on to the second type of storytelling situation, the interviews, which is interactive by nature and in the form of a dialogue, or guided storytelling. But at the same time, it also always depends on who was asking the questions, what was the purpose of the interview, and who was editing the text. This is the 1962 catalog interview of Michael Chow by Kenny Strampton. Michael Chow's family sent him to London when he was 13, all alone. By the time of the interview, Michael Chow was 23, just graduated and wanted to be an artist. And this is the second question of the interview. The first one is about Zen Buddhism, more like a showing off of knowledge from the interviewer. And then the second question is what Western artists have influenced their work. I think Chow answered in a very polite and clever manner. But by the way, this is also one of the few archives I found about East Asian artists in London at the time. So unlike the refugee artists from Europe who found home and friends in the UK, East Asian artists were excluded from almost all major exhibitions, and their records are nowhere to find. The first Mr. Chow restaurant opened 6 years later after this interview, so I believe he had a long struggle. And the below image is from a self-interview of the Neo-Dada sculptor Robert Mallory. And he answered himself of why do you use the method of the self-interview? Because I can ask myself the questions I want to be asked. The control of storytelling in artist interviews are not limited to their life stories. David Sylvester conducted a series of interviews with American and British artists in early 1960s for a BBC program. These interviews are very technical. Instead of asking about artists' lives, Sylvester is more interested in the art-making process. Transcripts of these interviews were later published in 2000, but it went through intensive editing. This is just one of the examples of Sylvester cut all the explanations from the artist, as if he's only confirming with the artist of his assumptions rather than having a conversation. So the above image on the left is the original transcript of his interview with Louise Nevelson in 1963. He asked, when you are working on a wall, are you working on the contents of several of the boxes simultaneously, or do you finish one box and go on to another box? Nevelson started to talk about how she was working in New York, even her mentality while working, with examples and in great detail. However, it was all cut. And as you can see from the below image, it's not even the yes to the original question. I think one of the problems is when a question is asked, the interviewer already had an expected answer in their mind. From all the interview materials I collected, Edward Roditi is the only author admitted that. In his 1960 Dialogues on Art, he had an interview with Marc Chagall. He first asked Chagall, at what age did you paint your first picture or first begin to draw? But Chagall started from his birth. when he just reached the point that as a child he had to work to support his family, Roditi lost the patience. And in the book, there is a monologue of Roditi himself, quote, Chagall seems to be tempted to wander off into family memories, such as those that he has already told us in his published autobiography, rather than answer my question more specifically. Like a stubborn analyst who has met with resistance in his patient, I try to bring him back to the point. And then the interview continued from there. But not every interviewer is like that. And for many established artists, they will constantly ask the same question. When did you first started making art? When did you decide to become an artist? For many artists, answering this question became a performance. They would tell the story again and again, polish the details every time until it's perfect. Henry Moore was one of them. He had a perfect story that he would tell every time he was asked the question. And it always started with, I remember quite clearly. It's a great technique of storytelling to be convincing. And these are two versions of the story. One from the 1954, for a broadcasting program called London Calling Asia, and the other one from 1960 BBC interview, Face to Face. In the 1960 version, Henry Moore added more details, including the name of the Sunday school. There's clearly a flaw in this story about the location. So was it in the studio, on the street, or an open shed? But it doesn't matter. In the 1960s version, Moore also created the dialogue of the passerby, who is not speaking to make the scene more realistic. In a later version, the passerby said an even longer sentence. And he's also not sure about the number of teeth, but that doesn't matter either. But the thing is, Henry Moore used to have a different story about the sculptures on the church he saw when he went to visit his aunt. This is a Yorkshire Post article back in 1949. Actually, in the 1954 interview, Moore told this story after the Michelangelo story. But in the later interviews, this story disappeared. Of course, the Michelangelo story is more engaging. Thanks to Vasari, everyone thinks Michelangelo is the greatest sculptor. And the story can also show how special Henry Moore was as a child. All he cared about was art. But I also think it's very interesting how the legends of one artist was used by another artist to create a new legend. And lastly, I want to talk briefly, because I didn't finish the reading, about the autobiographies of artists. So comparing to other storytelling situations, in autobiographies, artists can have more freedom to construct their own narrative. Writing shouldn't have been hard for artists, especially at a time who grew up with surrealism. However, it seems that after centuries of artists' stories being told by others, artists were quite unconfident to tell their own story. And the autobiographies were often written in an experimental and hesitating way. This is the autobiography, more like a memoir or notebook of the British artist and photographer Peter Rose Pulhan, who were living in Paris in 1930s. It started from his life experience, but turned all about food from chapter 5. Eileen Agar was asked to write stories of herself and her late husband, Joseph Bott. He told the editor that she was not a writer, but a painter, and she didn't feel capable to write, because she was like most painters, in her words, inarticulate. This clear line of artists draw between their own identity as a visual artist and storyteller is very interesting to me. As visual artists, they may be well aware of the limitation of both visual and literal representation. As Paul Nash stated in the preface of his autobiography, that since it is impossible to give a full picture of any life by means of autobiography, if it is to be published, I have called this a personal story outline. Here, Nash used visual art vocabulary to describe his concept on writing, and this link between visual art and literal thinking will be my future research focus. And my second hypothesis is that the evasiveness of artists telling their own stories came from the fear to be misunderstood, as their real story may not be able to fit into the public's imagination. This is a clip on the right from the autobiography of Iso Kuhong, a British artist and poet who grew up in India. She was part of the British Surrealist group and later left because of her occult beliefs. In this story, he wrote about when she was trying to join the mystical group Golden Dawn. He had a supernatural experience as if her mind was being controlled. But before writing this autobiography, she never told this experience to anyone. As she was bothered by it, she turned the experience into a fictional story. But somehow in this autobiographical writing, she felt safe to write it down. And she asked herself, why did I not confide this experience to my cousin, who introduced her to the group? And ask his advice. I don't know. Perhaps I was afraid of being told. I was always imagining things, and this was one of them. Artists grow all too familiar with remarks of this kind. I think this is the reason why I'm interested in the storytelling of artists. Artists are surrounded by so many stereotyped stories and mythologies. They have to hide their real story to a deeper inner self. Of course, we are no longer living in post-war London or high Renaissance or ancient Greece. We are now more aware of racial and gender issues, but new stereotypes and misunderstandings are still being created with media, algorithms, sometimes even worse. Now we know painted dragons cannot fly away, but do we want to believe, for example, there are Chinese artists working with local communities without any political purpose? This research is definitely not about which part of the artist's story is true or false, but it's about how can we improve the storytelling situation and keep the dialogues going. In his essay, The Anthropology of Storytelling and the Storytelling of Anthropology, Rodolfo Maggio observed that in anthropology seminars, workshops, and conferences, although the topics are usually interesting, the audience may still struggling to be engaged. However, during the coffee break, when the speaker is asked about the content of the paper, a story would often be told, and suddenly the audience are no longer puzzled or bored. It's because a living immediacy is created with the story, so the brains of both the speaker and the audience are synchronized. So just in case that is true, I would like to conclude my presentation with a personal story. At my final year in high school, I received a book from my uncle. The book is The Story of Art by E.H. Gombrich. I was told it's an art history book and Gombrich is a great art historian. It will help me to understand my future major. But it didn't. I finished the book and went to college with big questions. What is art history and what is art history writing? In the next few years, I worked in different fields, but the question stuck with me. Can the story of art really be written? What am I doing when I write artist biographies for exhibitions, catalogs, auction sales, or curatorial reports? So now I'm doing this research, not about the story of art, but the stories of art. Hopefully I will find the answer.
Thank you so much, Zoe. An amazing combination of materials there and insights, and there's so much that I want to ask you. But I wondered if we could start in the place that you talked about your hypothesis around artists being the fear of being misunderstood, and that might be one of the reasons in which they adopt certain storytelling techniques. And I wondered, do you have any thoughts on what your research suggests about what audiences want, what researchers want, what curators want, what a broad audience wants from artists? Do we expect artists to tell certain stories? Do we encourage them to create myths and legends and to perhaps to polish their stories perfectly like Henry Moore? Do you think your research tells us something about what non-artists want from artists?
That's a deep question. But I do think that, so these mythologies of artists are definitely not created by the artists themselves. If it all, like if in the Western art history, if it all started from Vasari, it's because he's like primarily a businessman and himself is dealing with art a lot. So these stories are created not for introducing the artists like their real selves, but there are like many more purposes behind it. So I think like, of course, these situations changed a lot nowadays. There are like many artists like working with storytelling, and they are working with their own identity and their own life stories. So I just think like maybe we are in this process of getting rid of the old narratives without being aware of that, but where we can lead this process to is what we can think more about.
Do you think there's examples or moments when we can see the value that has been attached to an artist's story, that the way that they position their family history or their background or even their ethnicity then becomes a way of supporting how their work is received or how it circulates? Is there a value to this storytelling that artists are performing?
This is what I've been interested in the materials I found, because many of the background stories in these artist stories of post-war London, it doesn't make sense to me. Like why your father's profession is important to your own practice, and is it like related to your own work or something like that? But so like in contemporary times, for example, we are still talking about the place of birth of an artist and why is that important. Maybe it's like a heritage from the previous narratives that we still need to work to get rid of, like, and create like more narratives of our own times. That will be what I'm trying to figure out with these materials. Yeah.
I was also wondering what the impact of digital technology might be on this process as well, because we're often commonly told that now that about the digital traces that we leave. So does it become harder to adjust your story over time because there are versions of it that are still there online? Or is there potential for more self-reinvention? And I was thinking about a project like Amalie Ullman's amazing Instagram project as being a kind of narrative, a kind of fictional self that she was able to create. Do you have any thoughts on what digital technology might be doing to storytelling?
Yeah, that was one of my original ideas of this research. It's like so. For many artists back in the post-war era, when they tell stories of their home country, like no one can fact-checking that immediately. But that situation changed now. So if you tell a story like if your family was a prominent family in your native land, they can fact-checking that immediately. So it also changed the artist's narratives, of course, and they need to think more about like the facts they are talking about and who can check these stories afterwards. And I think what I observed is that so artist stories are being synchronized from all platforms. So they're trying to keep all the stories into one narrative. So I do think that's very interesting. But as you just said, so the digital age also provides the opportunity to fake a story completely, and that's like another side of the effect.
I'd love to hear responses or questions from the audience, and just while people are formulating those, a final question from me, which is about archives. And so you spent a lot of time in the archives here at Whitechapel, at Tate, at the Henry Moore Institute as well. And I wonder, do you have any thoughts on the relationship between storytelling and what we find in archives? Because often we talk about archives as being as much about what's missing as what's physically there or digitally there. Is there a particular archival methodology that's necessary to do the kind of research that you're doing?
So I think, of course, all the archives are organized in different ways. So like in Whitechapel, our archives are organized by exhibitions. So for these archives, I'm primarily looking at the catalog folder. So like all the interviews are in the same folder. But in Tate, they're organized by the artist names or the like one author or the director of the museum. So it's a little bit harder because you need to go through all their like personal communications and try to find the dialogues they had with the artist. And so I think it's actually quite interesting. And of course, for Henry Moore Institute is dedicated to one single artist. But I also found like in other books, there are like also dialogues of him with another artist. And there's actually a book of Henry Moore of his writings, and they put all the stories together, so you can easily compare like stories from different times.
Well, my question is less like a question and more of an inquiry that I found quite, interesting by listening to how you articulate your archival research through storytelling again. So I find this fascinating mirroring of structure that you get access to the archive, and then before that storytelling happens, way before the archive was formulated, and then you get access to that. You build up your personal archive with your own logic and interest, and then you storytell that again today in a beautiful form. So my question is about how this storytelling construction works for you for this presentation and for your research, and throughout that process, how do you position yourself?
So this presentation is really just I just want to show you the materials I found. So I divided all the materials into like autobiographical notes, biographical notes, and interviews and autobiographies. But I think in the end it will turn into a writing, but the structure of the writing will be different. I'm thinking about I probably will reorganize all the materials into topics. Like the landscape will be one of the topics I talk about, like how artists talk about their hometown landscape, and also how they talk about their childhood, like their initial moment wanting to be an artist, and so it will organized in another way. Yeah.
And what about self-positioning? How do you position yourself in adjacent to the materials? Do you find it sometimes effective, or do you also archive your own feelings to that? What's your approach in relation to yourself, your body, your feelings?
I want this to be an anthropological research. So I'm taking the role of like a participant observer of all these materials, and of course I'm also working in art. But I'm looking at all these stories told by the artists or other people telling their stories. And also, but of course, like anthropology research is also some kind of storytelling. So it's like about observing and retold these stories, the situations you saw. So yeah.
I wanted to say that for me, this project sounds like an amazing, very interesting textual analysis. My question was, speaking of texts, most of the material you shared with us are like writings, texts. But you also mentioned like BBC interviews, and in one of the answers to one of the questions, you mentioned like audio. And I was wondering if you had the chance to kind of to see some audio, visual materials in which the artists would, I guess, someone else just mentioned that they sound differently from just looking at the text. You can't really tell their tone, their intonation, where they pause, where they kind of quicken, and where, and you can also kind of tell when they become vulnerable or powerful. So is that something you will be looking at as well?
Yes, that's actually a great question, because it was actually a suggestion made by Fellini from the Whitechapel archive, that at the first meeting I had with her about this research, and she suggested me to look at the photographs of the exhibitions as well, like how the artists were presenting themselves at the exhibition, and what was the installation view was like, so I can have like a full picture of the whole situation. I think that is actually very important. And at the same time, actually in the 60s and 70s, especially in the UK, there are like many TV interviews of artists. And there was like a period of like, to bring like artists on TV. Like also in the States, there are like many TV shows about artists. So they are actually doing performance and also doing interviews on television. So I did see some materials like that, and I will continue doing it. And also in like British Library, there's a whole archive of artists' life stories. Like it's like so many audios of artists telling their own stories, but the interviews took place in a later period in the 90s. So I think I will take it as a comparison to their earlier stories as well. Yeah.
Thank you all for such brilliant questions and responses, and I want to thank again Asymmetry Foundation and Delphina and all of you for coming, but most of all to thank Zoe for all your wonderful work while you've been our fellow and for today's presentation. Thank you.